Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, COVID, resiliency, crisis management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free, reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Alex Fullick there, so I'm really easy to find, and I respond to everything I get. Today, I have an esteemed colleague who is the chairman of the board for the Disaster Recovery Institute International and the DRI Foundation president. So I'd like to welcome to the show today, Mr. Alan Berman. Al, welcome to the show.
Always nice to be with you, Alex. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. And for
Good.
anyone who might not know, this is your second appearance on the show.
Oh. Do I get a bonus?
No, you got to get to about 10 or 12 or something.
Yeah, I'm not going to make it.
I think the last time you were on, I think you just became the DRI president, if I recall, because we met at the Continuity and Resilience Today conference, in 2019, was it?
2019. Yeah, I became chairman of the board in 2019, I think.
Yeah.
I had been president of DRI for about 9 years before I quote unquote retired. Didn't quite work out the way I had planned it, but
obviously not. Well, it's a lucky thing, organizations had you stick around considering, COVID and everything. It's good that you didn't fully retire and disappear. So we have a few things we're going to touch on today. The first one, we're going to talk about cybersecurity and privacy. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what are some of the key considerations organizations need to focus on immediately, considering the rise in cyber incidents like ransomware and other crimes that are out there? What do they need to do right away?
yeah, I think there are lots of things that we need to do and to do a whole series about what organizations are facing and what they should do as individuals, and then what corporations should do. And the two are vastly separated. Cybersecurity is different than anything else we've ever seen. From the point of view is, if you look at the latest IBM Ponemans survey, the average time to discover a cyber incident is 192 days. So think of a fire burning for 6 months and nobody's seeing it. So when people talk about incident response, it's totally different. So there's much more of a proactive approach to it. And when you look at, I think the last time I saw this is there were 50 billion, as we sit today, 50 billion devices that are network connected. Over the next decade, that number is probably going to triple as we see more Internet of Things type devices, Apple Watches, remote cameras, medical devices, automotive computers. And so we're facing an uphill battle over what we've got. And so we started to look at how do we address some of these issues? And we started with how do people at home, the average person who's sitting at home now, working from home, using their home computer, what are they supposed to be doing? And we can talk about, the fact that ransomware has become the big business that it's become. When ransomware started, just to give us some perspective about it, the average ransomware was about $55,000. And all of a sudden, we've started to see that number climb. If you look at Colonial Pipeline, 3 years after much of what we saw as ransomware, the price went from $55,000 to $5 million. About 3 months ago, CNA Financial reportedly paid $40 million in Bitcoins. So this has become a huge business. And when you start to look at it as business, as anecdotal, we've seen infrastructure as a service and systems as a service and disaster recovery as a service. Well, ransomware was being used as a service. There was a cyber intruder whose name was Grand Crab. And what he did is he invented some software that ransomware people could use to hunt down through the networks to find vulnerabilities. And Grand Crab had a great business model. He would rent out the software and collect a piece of the money that was retrieved by the cyber intruders. They collected about $2 billion in about 425,000 attacks. His cut of that was $150 million in profits, and he took the money and disappeared, and nobody's heard from him since. So ransomware is a reality. When people talk about attacks, I am particularly thankful for ransomware, because ransomware is the only time you actually know that the intrusion is taking place. When you take a look at all the other things, it takes months and months and months. Example of that is when Marriott took over Starwoods. They found out that Starwoods was hacked 3 years ago and nobody knew. So it's all good and well to scare people about what's happening, but it's also important for us to start to take some proactive measures to at least try to secure the networks we have and the devices that are connected to those networks. So there's some really easy stuff to do. One of the easiest things is for the software to be up to date. We find out that people are reluctant to use it. They've had problems with keeping things up to date. And so we want them to make sure that they really do keep their software up to date. It's easy enough to do, but if you look at the
what kind of software in particular, the applications
operating systems.
So we're talking any and all.
Yeah, you're talking iOS, for example. I mean, if you've got an Apple device, you're going to find that it gets updated every 3 or 4 months, and almost all of it is security. So if you look at some of the past activities and some of the big hacks were WannaCry and NotPetya, those were in old systems. I mean, even going back to Vista, which is 2017. I mean, so you start to look at the fact we don't do that. Old equipment. I mean, we have routers. I mean, now that we've gone to wireless networks, we have all of the routers that are actually out of date. About 2 years ago, the FBI was telling people to reboot their routers every day because they couldn't find a different way to do it. One of the questions that people ask me all the time is, how do I know if my router is out of date? The fact you ask me that question means your router is out of date. Replace it. I replace mine every 2 or 3 years simply because it just gives me more security. The other thing is creation of passwords. Don't use the default passwords. You look at Equifax, who had a big hack about 2 years ago. Mm-hmm. When most systems are brought in, the password is admin and the ID is admin. And sure enough, that's one of the ways it was hacked. I shouldn't complain a lot about Equifax, because when I complained about it last time, I lost 20 points on my score. So true story. And it was a true story because there was an issue with Equifax where the CFO and 2 of his direct reports sold their stock, reportedly sold their stock 3 days before they announced it. And so when we brought that to the attention of people, it did cause somewhat of a kerfuffle, a great word. The other thing is passwords. ABC 123 Starwoods. We're getting more and more complex passwords, but I think one of the great stories was Kanye West was at the White House and he was visiting President Trump, and he turned on his phone to look at his messages and entered his password, and the cameraman was standing over his shoulder and his password was 0000. So we're asking people at least to make them more complex. Double identity is a pain in the neck, and you've got to get a code from your phone, but believe me, it's far more secure. I get probably 2 a week where somebody has tried to access my account and I've gotten the code on my phone. And so I really feel it's a much better protection. Well, now that we've gotten through the easy stuff, let's give you some things that are a little more difficult. One of the things is if people are going to come over to your home and use your network, have them use the guest network. Almost all routers now have a guest network. It will keep them segregated from the network that you connect to your office, and it'll give you a lot more protection. The other thing is that devices that do plug and play automatically connecting to your network, you should avoid those. There's absolutely no security,
Can
and
you
don't
give an
assume that
example?
no one will.
Can you give an example of those kind of devices for people?
Yeah, a lot of games are plug and play. So if you plug it into your device, um, they will automatically start. Some of them sit on USB device drives. So you
Mhm.
want everything to make sure that you sign on to something and provide some kind of security. We saw that in the early days when we had lots of plug and play devices. So your PS2 and your PS3 type things. Just remember all of those games are connected to your network. Anything that is probably running in your house runs on that network. We could talk about even some things that you're not aware of. So for example, if you start to look at home appliances, smart refrigerators, smart TVs, all of those are listening into everything you do. The fact that you now have voice command for your TV means it's always listening. Alexa is always listening. So all of those devices connected to your network can be hacked. In fact, it's not unusual for people to find out that they've been hacked through their TV. Most of us don't shut off that ability to do it. Um, Google Home had the problem with the devices where um, conversations were being recorded even before they sent out a command. So just remember the device is always listening for you to say Alexa, and hence can be recording everything. Um, Refrigerators, TV, almost any device is capable of sending out messages. So Samsung's refrigerator, when it first came out, people hacked into it and performed message sending of seen messages out. Just remember, it's a computer. Everything that sits in those things are computers. Even vending machines have been hacked so that they will send out messages and take down systems. So we've really got to be careful about what we connect to our network. Um, but to finish up, we have a lot of old equipment. We should start to make sure they're up to date. If not, make sure the software is there. We should be able to start to look at devices that connect to the network, but we think for some reason really are harmless, and almost none of them are. We've seen HVAC systems hacked so that they shut them off in the middle of winter and there's no heat or there's no air conditioning. So I think we have to be vigilant about the fact that anything that does connect to the network can be hacked. Even poor Barbie, who Mattel came out with a Barbie that had artificial intelligence. Um, that some hackers got to it and taught Barbie a new language. So the conversations with children were really X-rated. But just remember, they're all computers and they all have this ability to give people access to the network. And the simpler the device, the easier it is to hack. We talk about the Internet of Things, or refrigerators, watches, air conditioning systems, medical devices. All of those devices are easily hacked and can cause great damage. Hospitals are becoming much more wary of the fact, since the University of Alabama, for example, uh, hacked the system and showed that they could actually increase the pace in pacemakers to the point where they could actually kill the person who was using them. And so, being an old James Bond fan, you start to look at those things that you can do without being in the room for people. But
Mhm.
I think that we've started to, and now that we're home, we've seen this huge increase in security breaches emanating from home. Same computer that you use to run financial uh, programs from your computer. So much for those things that you can do in a home environment. But I think the issue that's facing most organizations is, what do they do for cyber resilience? What do they do to ensure that they have a process in place that will be able to protect them from events, and then they be able to react to those events that took place. And what we're seeing is the integration of cybersecurity and cyber resilience into business continuity. The National Institute for Science and Technology in 2019 came out with what they considered to be a cybersecurity framework. It turns out that the framework is much more about cyber resilience, because if you look at cybersecurity and how it relates to cyber resilience, it relates the same way as risk management relates to business continuity. So cybersecurity and risk management are all about preventing an event from occurring, being proactive. Business continuity and cyber resilience are all about reducing the impacts when an event occurs. We know we can't prevent them all, so we have to have a strategy that mitigates against the consequences of an act. So if you look at cybersecurity and risk management, they tend to be proactive and try to prevent things from occurring. If you look at what we think is going to be a cyber resilience model, it looks like business continuity. It tries to reduce the impact. And so when we look at it, the 5 elements look pretty much the same. One is to prepare and identify. The other is to protect. The third one is to detect when an event happens, and then to respond, and then to recover. The first 2 pieces of identifying and protect really fall into cybersecurity, the preventive piece. The detection falls into this very neutral area, because typically cybersecurity people don't find out that they've been hacked. You know, we go back to that model of 196 days it takes to identify that an event took place. It usually is identified by somebody outside of the cybersecurity realm. So we start to look at how we deal with the challenges of trying to prevent and then trying to react once something happens and to limit the damage. And so we built all these information security systems to secure the information, to protect confidentiality, integrity, and the availability of data, and try to offer an entity-wide protection. So it's proactive things that you think about: antivirus, scans, network protection, firewalls, active monitoring, the whole list of things we do to try to deter people from breaking into our system. But what we also know is it happens. And so this detection piece that we talk about falling into the middle is where cybersecurity ends because the incident has already taken place. And then the cyber resilience piece, this piece about responding and recovery, takes place. And so the emphasis of a lot of organizations as we look through things like operational resilience and the integration of proactive measures and reactive measures is to try to integrate those things so that we can come up with a response that limits the damage. And cyber is clearly the one. Nobody evacuates, nobody shelters in place. Most people don't know the incident took place. So all of those things that we're used to talking about, like incident management, don't really take place. And so we start to incorporate comprehensive cyber incident response management. What do the cyber people do now that they've learned this lesson and try to be more proactive? And what do the business continuity people do? And so the idea of this respond and recovery, if you look at business continuity as being event neutral, it only cares about effects. It doesn't care what the incident was. I was with a research firm before I started in banking, and by 1995, we had discovered 146 causes of disasters, 146 things that have taken companies down. Well, it's impossible to deal with that, have a strategy for 146 alone. Think of permutations.
Yikes.
You know, think of the Great Eastern Japanese earthquake. You've got a huge tsunami, an earthquake, and a nuclear meltdown. Nobody has a strategy to deal with that. So we really try to deal with the effects of it. You know, and in this case, it takes place in one of the 3 major effects, not the facility and not really the operation, but in the technology. And so we start to look at how do we blend this into the business continuity model, because cybersecurity doesn't have a response model. Cyber resilience will have it, and resilience in effect, but it doesn't have it. So our job is to minimize the disruption to operations whenever we have a data breach. And then to expand our risk assessment process and the cyber assessment process to identify the weakness and move on from there. And then the last thing is to start to recover the operation. Long time ago, I explained to people that the simplest way to take companies out of using technology is not to attack their main processing system, but first to attack the backups. And so if you attack the backups and you destroy the backups, the first reaction once you have a system failure is to install the backups. Once you do that, you've ruined everything. And so we've seen strategies for that. We have what's...
But hang on, that doesn't, you said that one of the things was the IBM, the 196 days, backups don't usually go that far. They only go back a month. So
it doesn't matter. Yeah.
How would you restore backups when that problem is in your backup?
Because the backups are connected to the system, all I have to do is put the malware into that process. And because you don't test the backups except maybe when you run a test, and then it's truly not a full test, but you only run it when you have a problem, well, I've destroyed the backups. You just don't know it because you haven't used it. It's like taking the air out of your spare tire. You don't look at it every day.
Yeah.
The day you do look at it and it's flat, now you have a problem. And it's very similar to that. So we've come up with new ways of doing backups. We have what are called isolation, where the data backup is to have secondary or tertiary copies of the backup storage target segmented and unreachable through the public portions of the environment. I've totally separated them. We've even done something even more than that. We've done something called air gapping, where we create an air wall or an air gap in network security. And so it doesn't connect the backup systems to the primary systems. And so they're always disconnected. So it's harder to do that. So as you start to look at it, one of the things that ransomware does is it prevents you from using your backups because already they've been stored in your backup. So there's nothing to back up to. And so you need to purchase the key. The good thing about ransomware is that they're usually honorable people. Once you pay them, they let you go back to work. And so that's it. But we're starting to look at this whole entire strategy on not only identification, which is difficult because we learned from the last incident. And so hackers are proactive and we tend to be reactive. The detection piece, which takes place outside, because if we could have detected it, we probably would have prevented it. And then the response and recovery, how do businesses start to operate again? And so it's become a real complex model, but we've created this model for cyber resilience. And so now we're starting to build a model that says cyber is like all other incidents. We have to figure out how to keep the operation going. We have to try to figure out what will mitigate against losses. And so it's become an interesting cat and mouse game, if you would. How do we start to be proactive? But I think to this credit, they've tried to create a standard that people can use, a framework, if you would. Probably framework is a better term. A framework in which we can start to build this resilience model. And we will see how it's done. We, no commercial, but we built a course around it, but integrated business continuity. Because we think in the end, cyber is going to be like IT. When we first started, IT was totally separated from the business continuity. Yeah. We're seeing cyber the same way, but we think that the end of this, when we look at resilience model and operation resilience, where there has to be an integration in the organizational reaction to it and the response the organization does.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our first segment. We are talking with Al Berman, the DRI Foundation president, and we will be right back. Welcome back. Today we are talking with Al Berman. Al, lots of great information there about cybersecurity. Do you have any final thoughts on it before we move on to our next topic?
Yeah, I think just one thing, and we're starting to, organizations talk about risk transfer. the ability to transfer the risk from one place to another. And the vehicle that we most see is insurance. Um, Even in cyber insurance world, there are now 7 or 8 different kinds of insurance. Defense against damage to data, copyright and IP, defense costs, regulatory coverage, remediation, information assets, the restoration of data and systems and the cost involved in that, denial of service attacks, and even ransomware. The one piece of advice I would give you is the same thing the insurance company would say. Make sure your lawyers look at this. Insurance being a big factor in it. And just as a quick aside, one of the things that people have always looked for was a return on investment from business continuity. And we found one recently, one very embarrassing to me personally, and then anecdotally another one. But one of the things that I can show you truly is a return on investment is the ability to reduce insurance premiums, a hard cost in everybody's budget. Short anecdote is I was working as a consultant for an organization and I headed Marsh's, who was the largest insurance brokers, business continuity practice. And I was walking by the CFO's office and he called me in and he said, Al, you know something about insurance? And I said, yeah, I guess I do. He said, well, we have a new insurance person and we're going to increase our business interruption insurance, the insurance that covers you for loss of profits, not revenue, and fixed costs like rent, from 35 million to 50 million. And I said, well, why are you going to do that? And I'm a numbers person. I go, he says, well, we're $1 billion corporation. I said, you're a $4 billion corporation, but your profits are only $170 million, of which 70 is the operating profit. So why would you insure $70 million with $50 million worth of insurance when we know you're only going to be down for 3 days? So if I were you, I would reduce it to $15 million, save myself $700,000 and give me 10% of that. I learned a very valuable lesson that they do not give the answer before you negotiate the fee. But it's really a hard sell. I'll give you, this is a true story. One of the largest financial institutions in the world just signed the $3 million contract for somebody to look at this integration of insurance into business continuity and business continuity and downtime. And they're paying the consulting firm $3 million. The financial institution feels it'll save $100 million over the next 10 years. So if you really want it to be of vital importance to your organization, this is really a hard sell and a hard savings for your organization. Mm-hmm. Which gets us back into the world of, what is the regulatory environment going to look like? And how are we going to deal with it? Do you want to break?
There's a lot of that. A lot of people are talking about, especially when it comes to resilience, compliance now and regulation, and the FCA out of the Bank of England with their new standard regarding
which is now PRA. They changed that acronym to make you to screw with you colonists. That's all I can tell you. But it's now PRA. PRA is really interesting. It's really came out of Bank of England to try to integrate governance and business continuity and risk management into something that was really create a standard. And I think it's going in the right direction. It's calling for this integration that we talked about before. And I think that we're going to see the use of that. But the real issue that we face when we look at this is the amount of regulations. GDPR and the California regulations and the Colorado regulations. There are 37 states in the union that have their own cybersecurity requirements. It'll be 50 by the time we get to the next, probably by the time 2022 is over. And they all have to do with privacy and the reporting and what the requirements of corporations are. And I think that it's going to be difficult for organizations to deal with this. I have to do a presentation, I think next week, to talk about how do you do that? What kind of structure do you need? What kind of corporate governance do you need? Um, because what you find out is there almost nobody in the organization is responsible for this. I think probably the exception to that may be healthcare organization where it falls under the chief compliance officer, who's usually the general counsel. And so there's a center there to talk about the regulatory requirements. But in most cases, you're caught up in FFIEC for the banks and the FDIC regulations and the HIPAA regulations and PCI for credit cards, several for the electric utility industry. Then you have national ones, GDPR. The United States doesn't have a national one and hasn't, probably will never have one. Australia created a new one. The Prudential Regulatory Authority, the one that is the Bank of England and the Operational Resilience Framework. Every country is coming up with them. Every state in Puerto Rico by the end of next year probably will have one. And so when you start to look at how do you comply with it, it's difficult for your organization. What is even worse, and it will lead us into the next segment, is the fact that now suppliers have to comply with it. So if you're a bank, every one of your suppliers has to comply with the FFIEC ones. If you're a healthcare organization, they have to comply with HIPAA. If you're a utility, it's FERC and NERC. But the idea is that's expanding down the supply chain. And so now you're responsible to make sure that all of your vendors comply. It's not their responsibility, it's your responsibility. And so now you need a whole program, a whole governance to decide what the regulatory environment is going to be. Sorry.
Well, let's move into supply chain. Let's move into that. I know you've got lots, and you said during our break, one of your favorite subjects. So
I was being sarcastic, but I do have a closet full of toilet paper. I will tell you that. We went right into, we got a supply chain problem. And I think it's a multi-supply chain problem, and it's different than what most people think it is. I think it started with Suez Canal, and you get 380 some odd freighters sitting back there and backing them up for 2 weeks, and that starts the chain. But I think that when we look at the supply chain, we're looking at what's on the shelf, what's not on the shelf, and how do we deal with that. I think it's even worse than that. I think this is one, and it's probably a little bit afield from where we are, but to talk about the fact that this is a manpower, personnel issue. There are, I think the last job opening number I saw was 10.4 million people in the United States. It's 10.4 million people who have left their jobs and are looking for something else. The record was, I think, last month where it was 11.1. But prior to that, I guess we got to go back to 2018, and it was just a little over 7 million. So there's this whole issue of supply chain. When you talk about the things backing up at the ports, and what do you do about 40-foot containers? We don't have enough truckers. So I think that the supply chain issue is being driven almost by the labor force. It's not that we don't have them; they're sitting in the middle of the ocean. The Port of Los Angeles just went to a 24-hour-a-day operation.
Mm-hmm.
But every country is short of truck drivers, whether it's lorries in England or truck drivers here or in Germany. People are leaving the trade, and it's one of those unforeseen consequences. We put in a lot of safety regulatory requirements for truckers, and it has inhibited their ability to make money. It's put them under constant regulation, and it's a dangerous occupation. It's not one that you see it. One of the things that we've looked at is also an aging population. 2/3 of the people of this 10 million people who are out looking for jobs are 55 or older, and they're going to retire. I mean, the pandemic forced a lot of retirement. One is people saved money. It was interesting. I can tell you, I saved money. We didn't go on vacation, and we didn't go out to eat, and we didn't do the entertainment thing. So people saved money, can afford to do it. The other thing is that they're realizing is, and again, I'm sorry about the numbers, but there are 75 people for every 100 job openings in the United States. And so people are sitting it out knowing that wages are going to increase. It has no choice. We don't have a choice. We see inflation. It'll be reflected in labor costs. So I think that they're holding out for more money. So the fixed goods, the goods that we're waiting to get them off their ships, are starting to be impacted by the lack of people in trucks to take them off those things. Just 4.4 million people quit their jobs in September. They just walked off their jobs. Now, that doesn't mean they're unemployed, because those numbers clearly going down, but it means that they're looking for other opportunities, and we're shifting people away from that portion of the labor force. Can't make enough money being a trucker. So we looked at businesses. We created a model a long time ago, and people would talk about service industry, those things that create paper or electronic paper, and hospitals and things like that. And then we talked about manufacturing. Well, several years ago, we realized that transportation was a huge factor in dealing with that. And we didn't build a good model for how do we continue to get that. So I think that we're looking at, give you some idea, we're looking at the import side of it. The export side of it is a whole other business. The farmers in California, the dairy farmers in specific, produce things like powdered milk and powdered butter that get shipped off to Asia, for example. Well, they can't find enough transport to get it out. So they do about 50 million tons, 50 million pounds a month. They're down to about 20 million. And the interesting thing is that the ships are leaving without those products, because the amount of money they make coming in. So containers used to be about $2,000 a piece, those 40-foot huge containers.
Yeah.
They're now between 20 and 25,000, i.e. inflation, but there's just a huge demand on it. Going out of the country, going from the United States to Asia, that's still $2,000, but they're leaving empty because they don't want to wait around for truck drivers to come and load this. You're seeing California farmers driving 1,000 miles to Vancouver to find the port that'll take their products. So we're going to see it on both sides of this, things that are produced by the United States and they're exported, which the papers have not covered at all, because they're covering the problem that I can't get toilet paper on my supermarket shelf, because that's what consumers look at. But from an economic point of view, that may be even more devastating. And so we've reached the point where we've impacted the labor market to the point where you can no longer get things that you need. You're seeing it, we can't get enough chips. I mean, Taiwan can't produce and ship enough chips for car manufacturers. And so we're seeing inflation, and at the same time, it's impacting production. And so somewhere along the line, the economic model has got to figure into this. We're worried about gas prices, and for a long time, my friends of mine, we've been talking about, well, just get rid of, use this strategic petroleum reserve. Now, we have a huge one that can drive prices down, and for some reason, there's a reluctance to do that. And I think that as we start to look at the supply chain, business continuity, people have to figure out, how do you work with less? How do you work with less product coming into the market? It's, for the most part, we have ignored the fact that supply chain is important in two aspects. One is clearly so that we can produce goods and services. But two, and I did this when I worked at an insurance company, product recall. When we have a problem with a product, we need to understand what that supply chain is so we can find out where the defect was. So it's a double-edged sword for us not being involved in it. Just as an aside, we often talk about what skill set business continuity people should have. And I'm always amused by the fact that they say, well, you need those soft skills, you need to be able to write and be able to speak. And it's always been my opinion, and clearly my career has gone that way, is really I need to understand the business of the company you're working with. I mean, that becomes the most important thing, whether it's conversations with executives on how you can help them, or to the point that you start to foresee problems like supply chain and have built that into your process. And if you haven't built it into your process, you can be rest assured almost nobody does, because we look at things from a processing point is we look at upstream modeling. We look at the fact that we know when we haven't gotten something. And that's a very short interval because it's from one step to the second step. As you start to build that model, you realize that somewhere along that is the full supply chain for the organization, and that needs to be integrated. And transportation has been one of those things that have been left out, and we're starting to see the consequences of that. And
Well, that leads me to a question then. With obviously going through the last year and a half of COVID, has these existing supply chain issues that, for the most part, as you said, have kind of been ignored or not really received the right amount of attention, did COVID trigger these supply chain issues, or has it really just exasperated what was already there and brought it to the forefront much faster than, let's say, if COVID didn't happen, we'd be experiencing this maybe 10 years down the road instead?
yeah, I don't think it'd be 10 years. In 2019, we realized that there was a shortage of truck drivers. And the
Okay.
shortfall was somewhere between 30 and 40% that we thought would be over this decade. So we knew that that was starting to happen. COVID absolutely sped up the process. People were reluctant to leave the house. People don't want to take the chance of being on the road and having to stop in places where they didn't know they were protected. And because of the way the job market is, they have options. Up until now, there weren't a lot of options for them. They can do local deliveries. You're seeing that Britain is one of those real cases where, people who were driving petroleum trucks said, I could drive a bakery truck and make the same amount of money because the wage limits are probably the same. Yeah, I think that it's a combination. We started to see the shortfall in employment, and all of a sudden in 2020, it blew up. People said, I'm not going to go out and risk my life.
Mhm.
And I think that became a way of life. They started to look for a safer job, one where there was less contact, when there was less vulnerability. And because wages are now being driven up and truck drivers still get paid by the mile, that disparity is shifting away from driving. And I think that's the economic consequence of this. But you're right, COVID absolutely exacerbated this.
We have less than 3 minutes left. Did you want to take 2 minutes with any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think we're facing interesting times, and I'm sure I've heard people talk about the new normal, and I have no idea what that means. I know the new abnormal is going to be whatever's around the corner. I think we built a real strong regimen for starting to address these problems. I think we have more trained and more skilled and more educated people being involved. I think organizations are shifting. They're looking at things like operational resilience, where they're going to amalgamate all of those processes that can cause disruption. So I think the future is bright. I think strong organizations are adapting to it now, but I think it starts with the fact that the organization recognizes there are problems and deal with those at the very top. New organizations, new governance, new policies and procedures, things that adapt to the reality of today's workers from home. I think you're right about the fact that people are not going to go back to their office. I've seen the good life. The children are back in school. I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to commute 4 hours a day. And when you look at what I think is an underemployment problem, when all these jobs going wanting, people are going to be able to use that as negotiating their terms of employment. And I think we will see a new model. I think we will have to deal with the new reality. People are not going to go back to the office in January 1st. We've heard that from too many people who said, no, I don't want to do that. I can get another job and I can get the same compensation and I don't have to commute and I don't have to live with dangers. I can be with my children. So we may have built a new employment model for the foreseeable future. And I don't know what that does to commercial real estate values, but it can't be good.
Yeah. And on that note, we've come to the end of our show. Al, thank you so much. I hardly interrupted you because you had so much.
I'm on a roll.
Yeah, you were on a roll. You just had so much to share, and I didn't want to interrupt you. So thank you so much. You did share a lot of thoughts with us today, and I really hope listeners were paying attention to what you had to say.
Well, thank you for allowing me to do that. I sort of feel good about it.
Oh, good. Well, and I'm glad it's second appearance, and I'm sure at some point there will be a third.
Thank you, sir. Enjoy your day.
You too. Thank you very much. And everyone watching and listening, stay prepared, everybody.
Bye.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.